welcome to the Charlotte Mason Show. I'm your host, Julie Ross, again here with the amazing Shay, who just had a birthday. Happy birthday.
Yay. Thank you. You're 49. Very excited.
Woohoo! Oh, you are so young. And we are in volume 6. We are wrapping up book 2. So the book 2 section, I just want to clear, these were like little individual pamphlets when they were originally published, and then they were added to this volume. So you can kind of see she's repetitive. She's repeating a lot of what is actually in volume 6, but because these would have been little brochures on different topics that people could have purchased. So we talked about, her kind of overview of a liberal education in elementary school, secondary school, and then the chapter today is continuation schools. Shay, I was thinking as I was reading this that this is like the extra credit chapter. These are for the people who are like, I want to go deeper. I want to like get the A++. I'm going to read this chapter. What are you thinking about this one?
Yes. Yeah. She has lots of repeats in here, and there were lots of names and historical figures. I had no idea who they were. I had to look up. I got to be honest. I have lots of notes.
Who is so many names. So many names. Yes. That's what I'm saying. Like, this is like definitely the bonus chapter here, people.
Yes. And it's very obvious, too, that she is talking to people of her time period. So she has other writings that I feel are more relative if you're reading them in 2023. So you have to understand some of the historical context for sure. But I do think that some of the quotes that she has in here,
and she ones I use a lot. Mm-hmm.
By the time she writes this, she's like, look, I am confident in this. I'm laying it out. This is the way this needs to go. And some very important summaries in this that are great, to end out this book. But yeah, it's not the easiest chapter. This is definitely the extra credit nerd chapter.
Yes, sure. Right. Okay. So for all the extra credit nerds out there who want to go deep into this chapter,
welcome.
Let me give kind of a little context here of what is even happening, because I really had to go into that first, because I was like, what is even a continuation school? So the name of the chapter is The Scope of Continuation Schools. So we actually, interesting enough, do have continuation schools in the United States. Did you know that, Shay? I did not know that.
Did not know that.
Specifically, the ones I saw were out west, mostly California, and they were for students ages 16 through 18 who are not going to be able to graduate, most likely from high school. And so this allows them to go to school 15 hours a week and then work the rest of the time and get extra special individualized attention to get the basic high school requirements they need to get their high school diploma.
I did not know that. I've not heard of that.
So I know, and I'm like, well, that's very interesting. So in a way, it's very similar to what she's talking about here in these continuation schools. So just to back up a little bit, so again, she's writing this after World War I, and up until this time in England, at age 14, you would be done with compulsory education. So most boys would go on to university. Girls would have to be privately tutored, which is why she has forms 5 and 6, where those would mostly just have been for girls. And she talks about that in this chapter, that, this kind of education, is going to propel these women so much further in their lives, because it was such a really deep, rich education that she was providing in her programs in those forms. And if you're a mom and you want to have some other culture and you want to grow your own mind, just look up Charlotte Mason's programs for forms 5 and 6 and try to read some of those books those girls were reading, because they're like phenomenal.
Unbelievable. They are. Yes.
Like more than my children are reading at university level. So yes. She had such a high view of children. But so in 1915, the Fisher Act was passed in England, and that made an allowance. Actually, I think that is what made it up to 14. Before then, it was even younger, where they could leave school. But it allowed for these continuation schools. So for ages 14 through 18, they could still receive some sort of government education for free while also being employed. So they saw the need that, these 14 through 18-year-olds, they need to be working, right? Most of them needed to be providing for their families at this point, right? But they still needed some education in order to raise the kind of citizens and have the kind of society that they wanted. So just to keep in mind of what we're actually talking about here. So the principles she's going to discuss here are for ages 14 through 18 that we now think of high school. So if you are on the verge of high school or you have high schoolers, I do think this is a great review of
yes, it's a good point.
Saying should be taught in these ages. Now, again, this continuation schools were not full time. So she talks in here about having them, I think, like 8 hours a week or something like that, whereas the ones in California are like 15 hours a week. But it's also a great reminder because, and I was looking at what England does now. And if someone's from England and you want to like provide more information or call me or invite me over, I'll be happy to cross the pond anytime.
Can I go, please? We come as a match set. I have to go too.
We're coming. Shay and I have very important research we have to talk to you about. But even now, the compulsory age is only 16, where in the United States, it's, 17 or 18. Mm-hmm. So for them, they can leave at 16 if they are going into some kind of an apprenticeship or trainee program, which I wish we had here, or that they're in like part-time school, part-time working, or they're going to university. So it gives them so many options. And I think,
there's so much more flexibility there. I've looked at that, not now, but I've looked into that before. And the options that they have are much greater, the choices for kids those age to start moving into adulthood, whether it's an adulthood of education sort of thing or a job sort of thing like you're talking about. I wish we had that.
And I think it's good for us as homeschool parents because we do have that option. Our kids do not have to be in school till age 17 or 18 for 8 hours a day. So we have that flexibility. And, both of my kids, once they were around age 16, they worked during the week. They didn't just work on the weekends or at nights. So they did work some during the homeschool week. And they also took college level dual enrollment classes. So we have those options or some kind of, tech school or something like that, where, think outside the box. I think at this age, they need something like that. Don't you think?
I agree 100%. I have kids that have done both. I have one that went to tech school and I have kids that dual enrolled, because I have a rising senior who's dual enrolled too. And they need to start owning their education, which she discusses here in that way at that age in this culture we live in. So it's making their own choices about what does this look next, like next for me.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm glad we have that as homeschoolers, and some public schools do too. I know in our area there's a couple of public schools that do offer some dual enrollment, but it's not nearly the choices that we have as homeschoolers.
Right. And, to think outside the box, I think, at that age, because, I hear from people and they get a lot of pushback from their kids that are that age. And they're like, I don't know what to do. Blah, blah. And I'm like, they don't need to be doing school for that many hours. So look at what your state's high school graduation requirements are. Look at, if they are applying to colleges, what those college requirements are. But as a junior and senior, it's not a full course load. There's a lot of room for electives, and most
so of many options.
All my kids met their graduation requirements before they were seniors. They didn't have anything that they had to take.
Right.
So they could take college classes, So, as you're kind of thinking through those years, I think it's important to consider that you don't need a full curriculum for every subject for your junior and senior.
And it's interesting because she sounds thrilled here to have them for 7 or 8 hours. And she's so thrilled. She's like, think of what we can do in those 7 or 8 hours. We have them for this long. And I was just thinking.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
She says, we can do our part for the young citizen in those 7 or 8 hours she talks about. And I do feel like I look at mine as they were that age. They were able to accomplish a lot in 7 or 8 hours.
Oh, well,
because of the philosophy and the methods. We're not sitting in a class. In fact, I think the biggest transition for my children was getting used to sitting in a classroom for that hour. They're like, what do you mean? And like she talks about in here, I laughed at the function of where I'm not sure what it is, but she talks about the teacher just talking and how
Yeah.
that's like a waste of time. This is not, and so I do feel like my children felt that when they were forced to sit under a lecture.
Yeah.
Um, they were like, what in the world is this hour of listening that I have to do? And then I have to come home and read
And
and
actually do the
still
work.
chew this.
Right. Right.
I still have to do the art of knowing, like the
Right.
act of knowing, I'm sorry, that she calls. I still have to do that. So,
And I
yeah.
think it's encouraging. So her thing was, okay, they passed this law. They're going to develop these continuation schools for kids ages 14 to 18 who are working. They're going to come to these schools for for around 8 hours a week. What should we teach them? And that's
Yeah.
basically what she's saying here. Of course, she's going to say my philosophy, right? So she's going to
Yeah.
break down what some other countries are doing and
Mm-hmm.
say that's not the right answer. And here's my reason why my answer is the best. But I thought it's so encouraging because she's saying that these students would have grown up not in a Charlotte Mason program. They
That's
would have
right.
grown up most likely in we're talking like poor working class families here. Okay.
Yes.
And she's saying that these children can come at the age of 14, 16, 17 and use her philosophy and methods and see an amazing result.
Yes.
And I thought
And
that was so encouraging for so many parents that we talk to who goes, man, this is I'm really getting more into Charlotte Mason and trying to understand this philosophy. It sounds so wonderful, but my child's in high school. It's too late.
yes.
That seems so.
How am I? Yes. And I think it's so important to understand that the mind, because we're talking about mind works the same at 8, 14, 49. It must feed off of ideas. And so, if you haven't been feeding your children's minds these rich ideas in a literary sense in this age, it doesn't mean that you can't, that they've lost ground. And that's one of the notes that I made about this chapter, I think is the most encouraging
Mhm.
because we want people to understand you don't have to start at age 6 in Form 1 to gain the benefits of this type of education. You can allow your child to learn about the act of knowing on their level in the 9th grade, on the 10th grade, in the 11th grade. It doesn't matter because it's the same principle of how the mind works.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully this will be encouraging for anyone who's kind of in that boat and wondering, can I
Mhm.
start later with the high school or what would I do? And it's the same thing we've been talking about all these other episodes, just to give you like the Cliff Note version.
Yes, very
We'll,
much.
we'll
Yep.
break it apart. So she starts off like you were saying, she talks a lot about, okay, here's how these continuation schools work in Germany. She talks about actually going to Denmark and observing schools, which I think is fascinating, especially at this
Yes.
time period for a single woman,
A
the amount of
woman.
traveling she did.
And to have the confidence in her own um, observations.
Mhm.
Like, I have done this research, I saw this, this is the observation that I have, and I'm going to tell you that this is the result.
Mhm.
And I mean, the brilliance of that, of somebody during this time period to trust their own powers of observation and connections that she has is so encouraging.
Yeah, it really is. And it shows us we need to trust ourselves as well. So she kind of starts off with this utilitarian theory of education. So I want to kind of break that down first for people who are like, what is that? Because she's like, this is not the way to go. So this was big in Germany. John Dewey brought that into the United States. She has some other big names in here that she talks about from other countries as well. Okay. So utilitarianism can apply to many different things. John Stuart Mill, the basic overall kind of philosophy is whatever brings you happiness. And that's what you should be striving for in life is this happiness. And basically, though, what makes people most happy is being useful. So if we want to have happy citizens, we need to train them to be a useful part of our society.
Mhm.
So then schools became, utilitarian. Everybody's doing the same thing, right? That's
Yep.
where this name is coming from. And we're all little cogs in this little machine, and we all produce this result. And how can we give the bare bones of education that is going to make someone useful? Well, what's not useful? Religion, beauty,
Yep.
literature, time out in nature. That's not useful. Let's get rid of all of that, right? All the things, when you look at school textbooks written in the early 1900s, they had subjects of nature study. They have books like a handbook of nature study is written to teach teachers how to go
Yep.
teach nature study. Like that was just something you were expected to know how to do as a teacher back then. Nowadays, I didn't get any nature training. Did you in your college study,
No,
Shay?
no, the only class I ever had about anything like that was like science for the young child. And we thought it was super fun because we actually got to go to the pond on campus of the university and go outdoors for that. I remember we got nothing. And she even says that this utilitarian education loses the ideal element, which gives all education its chief power over character. And that's what those things that you just mentioned do. They do affect our character and our knowledge of God. They affect and how we see our place in the universe and how we value ourselves and each other. And so when we take that out, yes, it's usable, utilitarian, but it doesn't affect the interior of the people that got that kind of education.
Right. And I think we're definitely seeing the fruit of generations of being robbed of that. And it's
Rob.
interesting because she does talk about that in here. Let me see if I can find it. Oh yeah. So she's talking about, kind of the labor unrest that they were seeing in England and throughout the world during this time. And
Mm-hmm.
she's saying that a hungry mind takes what it can get. And the
Yes.
baker is apt to be lenient about prosecuting the starving man who steals a loaf. I do not hesitate to say that the constantly recurring misery of our age, labor unrest, is to be laid at the door not of the working man, but of the nation, which has not troubled itself to consider the natural hunger of mind and the manner of meat such hunger demands. So what she's saying is, you were seeing this labor unrest. The people are hungry for knowledge. We have been starving them. This utilitarian approach starves people's minds of ideas in beauty, in goodness. And when you get a society that's starving, they're going to try to find it. And then she said, that's what this labor unrest is, because we are people. We're not cogs in an industrial machine that we weren't created to just be useful.
That's right. And I will say, I think that's a great point to make if you're talking about, like we mentioned before, starting to follow this philosophy and methods with older children, is to understand that if you're seeing some of those results that she talks about, that, the frustration, it's because of the hunger of that child for real knowledge. Now, there is no 14-year-old, 15-year-old that's going to sit down and say, hi, listen, I'm really hungry for knowledge. And I'm wondering, I wonder if you could just feed my mind with some ideas. But
Right.
what I do think is that there are ways to help to move that child into feeding that hunger that they don't even know that's what they have. So
Can you
that
give
they
an example of that?
sure, I'll give you an example because I have my middle child was in ninth grade when we had followed Charlotte Mason during the younger years. But then when we got to high school, we were using sort of a co-op that we were in and following the high school that was there. Definitely not Charlotte Mason. So when my third one hit ninth grade, I was like, okay, there's got to be a different way to do this. So he was the first one that I put through Form 4 in completely with Charlotte Mason methods. We're following with some things, but and when I gave him his first history book in the ninth grade, that was a literary history text, he was very confused.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is this a history text? This is not what we've been doing. This is history. And so it took some shortening the lessons, breaking the pages down. No, I'm not going to have you read even for 20 minutes. We're just going to read these 2 pages and we're going to chew on this together. We're going to work on that habit of narration. And he was what, 14, 15 years old. So did he love it in the beginning? No. But as we continue to do that, working on it together, and I realize I'm feeding his mind with ideas rather than just giving him this test that he could just check off, then I begin to see the result of him feeding on those. It's almost like the metaphor she uses over and over. He's feeding the food of his mind so I could watch that mind grow with the same sort of result you would feed a muscular boy. right? If I start feeding them protein, you're going to start seeing the workouts work,
Right.
right? And so we weren't spending more time doing school. We actually were spending less time doing school because we weren't checking off these boxes.
Yeah.
But eventually, this is the kid that was able to understand all these incredibly detailed, hard to understand manuals for F-16s and working on airplanes and vehicles and processing all these really difficult concepts. And I really believe it's because he learned to grapple with ideas in a way my other two didn't have to do as much.
Yeah,
So,
I love that example, Shay, because I think some parents too will say like, "Well, I tried it, and then my kid like got really upset and they resisted." And I'm kind of like, "Well, of course they did.
yes,
Like I fed you lollipops your whole life, and now here's some broccoli. What do you expect
yes,
the child's gonna say, right? They're gonna be like, "What?" So
exactly.
our it's easier to do a textbook and do recall questions and fill in the blank worksheets
Yes,
than it is to grapple with ideas. And so
yes,
even adults, we're naturally lazy, right? So we're naturally gonna be like, I don't want to do the hard thing. I don't want to go to the gym at 5:30 in the morning, right? I don't want to lift those weights. I don't want to have to do that chore. Like, how much more are teenagers going to be like that, right? But
yes,
again, it's what you did is such a great example of make it smaller, make the little bites a little bit easier at first and build up that muscle rather
mm-hmm.
than, just throwing them a stack of Charlotte Mason living books that are huge
Yes,
for each subject and go, okay, I want a written narration and this every, like that's going to be so overwhelming, right? So it's again
yes,
like you have to start small, but they're going to be able to accelerate a lot faster when they're teenagers.
yes. 100%. And I've seen that. And I look at then the one that I have that's a junior now, and she doesn't know anything other than this. I mean, I didn't cut her any breaks in high school. We haven't used any textbooks. And so it's amazing how much easier it comes to her. Yes. But by that junior year, she's not grappling with anything that's any more difficult than he already was able to by that junior year.
Okay, right, yeah.
Um, so it was quickly that it progressed once I said, okay, we were using, Miss Mason in these subjects. Now at high school, we're not going to back up on this stuff. I'm going to give you all of it. It is doable, but I think this quote that it's on page 281 is one of the things, and I thought about this when I read it about him particularly. We hope so to awaken and direct mind hunger, that every man's mind will look after itself. And if you have high schoolers that you get frustrated because like some of the things that we talked about,
Mhm.
of course they want to do the easy work. Of course they want to. When you back up and start this, you have to tell yourself, I am directing mind hunger so that these children's minds will look after themselves later on. And
Mhm.
so that's the goal, and that's the thing that's pushing us, not just, okay, I'm just going to get through this subject or make it easy for my high schooler. And I think you'll be really glad if you're willing to take those initial steps.
Right. And I think sometimes you try to pare it down in this age. I'm like, okay, what they don't like school. So I'm just going to try to give them the bare bone. What's the minimum requirement you could do so that I can give you a credit in this class? And then we're moving on.
Yes.
Right. And
Yes.
because you're giving them like candy, right? Like they continue to push back and because they don't like it. Their mind is
Yes.
dying for something else.
Yes. And I have found that my high schoolers actually love a challenge. They may not love me giving them the challenge. Okay. They may not love it comes from me, and they are not going to sit down and say, oh, Mom, I'm so grateful that you gave me this really difficult book. But what they do appreciate is that you expect that they are capable of this challenging material. I think it says much more to a child than to put down a book and say, we're going to chew our way through this. We're going to figure this thing out. We're going to chew our way through it. We might just have to take a page at a time. I don't know. But you are capable of this challenge. Than it does to say, look, we just got to get this done. Let's just do this little thing and answer these little questions. And their mind doesn't have the opportunity to chew on it. And you don't respect them. Of course, it all goes back to that first principle, right? We're respecting them as persons, that they are capable of that. And teenagers respond to that. Or I have found that mine have responded to that in a very positive way.
Yeah, and I also liked what you said about because your son, works on airplanes, And people are always like, well, in high school, I really feel like we just need to stop some of this kind of humanities studies that are so prevalent in child raising education. So we really could just focus on math and science because my kid wants to do blah, 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 blah.
Right. Yes. But that's missing out on exactly what she's saying here. That's the very point. It leaves behind the ideal element that gives education its chief power over character. And one of the things I used to say is when he was first interested in this is, what kind of person do you want working on your airplane?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want a person that has a high quality of character, who would never let a bolt slip, who would report every single thing, that would make sure that they're working on that thing to the highest degree, and they learn those things from the rich literary way that they were taught in history and art and beauty and literature? Or do you want somebody that says, yes, I know the manual and I can just click it off, I'm able to do it?
Yeah, I'm a cog in a machine, I don't really care.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And there's only one way to get that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think she even was saying that in here, that these what kind of people are we making? She talks about the
Yeah.
magnanimous citizen here. How large is the feet upon which how large is the room upon which his feet have been set? So just focusing in on kind of math or science, you're losing the subjects that are going to shape the person
Mm-hmm.
as a person and their character. Right? It needs to be, she said, rich in God, rich in society, and rich in ourselves. Like we need to have these riches that are pouring out and being poured into us. All right, so then she goes, again, it's basically an overview of her philosophy.
It is
Even
very, it's
8 hours a week, they need to have living books. They need to narrate. They need to do the work of the self-education and coming up with these things for themselves, the act of knowing, putting it into their own words. And like you were saying, Shay, if you're starting with an older child, you start with oral narration, same thing as you would with a younger child, and then work your way up to a few written. But we're not just throwing them in with a book and going, okay, give me all written narrations. That's too hard. They are not used to this active knowing process of having to put the thoughts and ideas into their own words and share them. They need that oral or narration first. If they're older, they have a phone, they can text it to you, right?
yes, or like oral. We did a lot of he would speak it in and I would listen to it for later on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we did a lot of that. And it would start out with you can hear the tone of his voice, because he'd never done it.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't want to do it. But when you start to hear that spark and you can start to hear their minds chewing on those ideas, it's really worth the effort to put into it.
Yes. And she's still advocating a full feast. So she said they read English, French, and general history, 3 volumes, literature, contemporary with the history readings, natural history, physical geography, science, 3 or 4 books, scripture, chiefly the Bible. Every 2 brings a new program of work, the continuation usually of books already in reading. So, I mean, this is still a full feast.
Yeah, it is. And 7-8 hours a week.
Yeah, right.
But you don't have to have the long lessons. You're not reading the entire book. You're just giving them little bites of all those different things. I would have loved to have been in one of those schools.
Oh, for sure, right? And then people are always like, well, what about like the SAT? I got to make sure that they're prepared so that they can take this. And again, it's a big deal because it can save you a whole bunch of money. Trust me, I'm very thankful for our scholarships, right? But is that all I want my child to get out of their high school education, is a great score that's going to get them to save some money for this next thing? No, I want this part of their life to be enriching and shaping them as a person. So, it's a language unto itself. You can learn how to take test questions in a couple months with Khan Academy and practice questions. We hired SAT tutors that were fantastic because it's really a lot of gimmicks. And if you can have a teacher that can teach you kind of some of the tricks, it's worth every penny. But I'm not going to spend 4 years working on it.
No. And also because if you do focus on that, and I have seen this in so many families, that you're going to lose the appreciation of the other things that do affect their character, right? And we have such a short window to affect these children. I mean, I've got just a few more weeks with my junior, and then she's going to be a senior. And if you've had a graduating kid, you know what that senior year is like. I mean, they're
My
just like,
daughter's graduating this weekend.
oh,
I
I
know.
did not even realize that. Wow. It just goes by so quick, and we don't have a big time to affect their character, to put these beautiful ideas in front of them. And we pray when they move on that they will. But this little period of time, these little, 4 years, 14 to 18, when their minds are so open and they're searching and they're thinking, who am I going to be? And what is the world going to look like for me? And we have such a privilege to put these things before them. We don't want to back away from that just because we're too focused on a test that they need to take.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I love this part here. She's talking about kind of like teaching towards these examinations that they had to have. And she said, I've touched only on the more humanistic subjects, as whatever is done in math, for instance, the head of the continuation school will no doubt arrange. And indeed, so much has been done in the elementary school already that probably the keeping of fictitious account books would be sufficient exercise for young people who show some mathematical talent. So they probably have already done enough.
Yeah. And if they're like in love,
let's teach them how to keep books.
If they're in love with it, then let them move on. But if not, let's give them something practical that they can actually use.
Because let me tell you, having my own business, I wish I would have learned how to keep books. That would have been way more applicable to my life than like the advanced algebra classes I took, right? And calc.
Right.
I don't ever.
Yes. We can't do our taxes, but we can do a calculus problem, right?
Right. Exactly. Right. So like most high schoolers, they need practical mathematical training for sure. I mean, obviously you have to have certain credits for college and all that stuff. But all right, what else stood out to you, Shay?
Gosh, I have so many things underlined in this chapter because I think she really you can see her boiling down the way to say some of these things. Whereas in some volumes and some places it takes her longer to explain things. And I love this section. Let's see, I was trying to find the one little quote that I kept writing, yes, this, about the act of knowing. She says that we have which the act of knowing and that which we have read or heard becomes a part of ourselves. It is what is assimilated after the due rejection of waste matter. And I think that's one of the things that's so important for kids this age is that we want them to chew it up. And when they narrate, they are going to reject what is waste matter for them. Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful way to find out about your child, to listen to these narrations of what's important to them and what they're connecting to. Mm-hmm. That it can be hard to do in these years, 14 to 18, can be hard to connect. And, maybe you don't listen to the same people or go to the same, I don't know, places, or, they're starting to have their own identity. So when these children are performing the act of knowing with this subject matter in these literary forms, and then they assimilate it, it's really good information for us to learn about our kids, what they are narrating back to us. Okay, so that was important to them that they took away from this passage. They didn't notice the things that I noticed. And it really turns into, for me and my children, it has a great way for us to have some great conversations. I'm like, well, that's really interesting. You noticed that. I didn't notice that in this book. What I noticed was, and it moves even past just the act of narration that you would expect a younger child to have, but you really see that muscle that they can begin to have these intelligent conversations with you, that they've chewed this matter up and said, okay, well, I didn't really agree with that, or I didn't think this. And that's so important for this age.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
Because they're going to need to be able to do that without you.
Yes, we want them
to. And she ends here with kind of this, the reason we need such a rich feast in this humanities type of education, all children, even if they've never had it before, even if they only can get it 8 hours a week, it's better than never having it, is because of this kind of common culture she's talking about here, where we can understand when people are quoting different authors, quoting different ideas that people go, oh, yeah, I know who that is, or oh, I understand that. Um, and I think that was really kind of an interesting concept. She says, by the way, is the paucity of literature or historical allusions not in Latin to be heard in the house due to the fact that the audience cannot be counted upon to rise to a reference not included in the well-known school books?
Mm.
And we get that all the time, like with like Alice in Wonderland. Like, why are we reading this book? It's so bizarre. And
Yeah.
it's like Alice in Wonderland is quoted in so many things, so many allusions, commercials, things.
Movies. So many.
Shakespeare is
Yes.
quoted. Well, we don't need to be reading that, right? Like, so much of society is just quoting all these things, and by giving them this wide feast, they're able to interact with those allusions found throughout all of, I mean, even popular music, you know?
Right. Yeah. And she says, at the end, she says, there is no more dreadful sight than ignorance in action. And is this not the sight that is the present time dismaying us all? And I thought, wow, isn't that today? Is that ignorance in action is when you cannot connect to these ideas that we are putting forth in front of our children because we haven't fed them the ideas. Mm-hmm. So the encouragement is, if you're listening to this and you think, oh, I was going to give up on that when my kids were in high school, or we'll just do that in younger years and we'll drop off, or maybe my kid's older, it's too late. You still want them to have these sorts of ideas for their mind to chew on, because it's important for the rest of their lives. We don't want to see this ignorance in action in our own families.
Right, for sure. Yeah. All right. So that is the little extra credit chapter.
Yes. For all the nerds, including you and I. That would always do the extra credit.
Yes, you all will get gold stars for listening to this episode.
Keep it out with us all this time. We only have one more.
I know. All right, everyone. We will see you next time for our last chapter in volume 6. Bye.